Good afternoon. Uh, my name is Stephen Westbrook, though the course sometimes labels me Perry, and this is Multicultural Gifted Education, the oral exam. I am a sixth year teacher entering my seventh year, teaching high school literature. The first year of that was middle school. I'm never doing that again. And the other five have been spent teaching 11th and 12th graders. So the course objectives that I want to talk about from the syllabus, one is analyzing the influence of culturally responsive or unresponsive environments on the psychological, social, and emotional developments of culturally diverse students in gifted education and gifted programs. Um, there are two words, kind of back to back there, that I really hone in on for meeting this objective, or attempting to meet this objective. Obviously, some of the larger language, culturally diverse and gifted programs, that is more or less self-explanatory for all the standards. But for this one, I think it's important to recognize the importance of environments, literally and figuratively. Um, the My room is very British centric. I set it up that way when I first started teaching at Parkview because I teach British literature. Um, and so that was what was in my mind when I was setting up my room. It's very European centric. I've got prints of Monet and Picasso and Degas around my room. That's the decoration around my room, which is nice when I teach the Lady of Shalott and can point to a painting of the Lady of Shalott that's been on my wall all year, but it is not a culturally inclusive and culturally responsive environment in a literal sense. My room feels like white people. Um, I play music when my students are working or when they're writing essays. I play music over the speaker. And invariably, that music is, again, Europe-y, whitish music, Beethoven and Mozart and Brahms, which I have always thought of as good study music because my mother is a musician and that's what I grew up studying to, I guess. But it is not literally a culturally responsive environment. And I think it's important for me to uh, begin to acknowledge that my room needs to be more culturally inclusive as a physical environment. I also want to look at the word environment in terms of its figurative meanings, in terms of what we talk about and what we read and what issues we bring up because of the books and stories and poems that we read. Um, I want to make sure that I am reading things that are talking about issues that create a responsive environment for my students, that we bring up issues that matter to them, that we, for my, you know, students whose families have immigrated, that we discuss immigration and the issues that are brought up with that. For my black students, that the Black Lives Matter gets brought up. For the when we talk about the Me Too movement, that we talk about the Trevor Project and issues with LGBTQ students, that environmentally we are meeting all of the different cultural needs. And that leads into the second word that I think is important to talk about in this objective, that has been important for me to realize in this objective, and that is being responsive, being fluid, being flexible, not starting the year with one set of intentions and then just crossing all the T's and dotting all the I's, not just checking off every box that I intended to check off. The photo here, next to the picture, is one I shared at the beginning of this course as well. It's the protest that my students, as well as other students around Parkview, did in solidarity with the students from Parkland this past winter. Um, this was not something that we intended to talk about at the beginning of the school year because the shooting in Parkland hadn't happened at the beginning of the school year. But it became an issue, and more throughout this past school year and then over this summer, I have begun to realize how incumbent it is upon me to be responsive to what is going on in the lives of my students and to adapt how I teach, if not what I teach, at least how I teach, to adapt that to the environment that my students are living in. The other course objective that I think that I have really gained some appreciation for this summer would be demonstrating cultural competence in working with gifted students from diverse backgrounds. I chose this image because these two young men presented together in my room last year. The school labels them both Asian. That's the label that they fall under. Their backgrounds could not be more different. You have one young man who's immigrated from a relatively poor Vietnamese family, and another young man beside him who was born in Atlanta to a relatively affluent Pakistani family. Gwinnett County and Parkview call them both Asian students. So I think that cultural competence needs to involve a lot of nuance. And it needs to be culture. I like this. The course objective calls this cultural competence, not racial competence. And I think that's an important distinction because racially, these two do check the same box, but culturally, they have very little in common with one another. I think, again, it's important for me to, and all of us as educators, but as growing myself, it's important for me to provide a education where all of my students' cultures can access the material on equal footing. I can't totally change the curriculum. I can't totally throw out the curriculum. I teach British and American literature. That's what the standards say I have to teach. That's what the tests will cover. But I can do that in such a way that students from Black families, Latino, Hispanic families, and Asian families, in all that implies, Japanese, Vietnamese, Pakistani, Indian, Hindu, Muslim, Buddhist, can all access material written by dead white Christians in England on equal footing. So, what are my future plans for all of this? I want to start off. I think the thing that hit me the most this summer, the thing that really resonated me with the hardest, is the Ford-Harris matrix. I have been very intentional throughout my educational career in using Bloom's taxonomy when I write units, and particularly when I create projects and essays and assessments, that I'm hitting different levels of Bloom's taxonomy. And so this matrix was right there for me to jump into, adding that vertical component, the Banks component of cultural contributions, additive, transformative, and social action. I want to start pre-planning this coming week by rewriting some of my assessments to include this component, so that I am being more intentionally culturally aware in how I assess my students. I also want to start a new thing in my room. This is a plan for this year of whatever unit we're covering, whatever topic we're covering, creating a family tree. I kind of liked the My Peeps association with this, and I wanted to incorporate that into this. A family tree of influence for major texts and movements. Whatever we're talking about, I want to be intentional about visually putting it up in my room where we trace the influence of how we got here. I wrote in one of my discussion posts, or perhaps it was in my first position paper, that some things in especially British literature are not going to have a lot of influence outside of Britain, right? The Canterbury Tales was written at a time where Britain was isolated and insular, and there was not a whole lot of influence other than the greater London area in the writing of that. But once you get further in history, and particularly anything in American literature, is influenced by multiple cultures. And I think it's important to to point that out. Howard talks about the assumption that whiteness is right. He ties it back to Judeo-Christian beliefs that America was created by God in God's image, etc., etc., etc. I want to point out to my students what influences non-white culture had on things that are perceived to be inherently white. In my second position paper, I talk about this a little bit. For example, rock and roll. So if we were to, I include Bob Dylan lyrics as poetry. So if we talk about Bob Dylan was influenced most directly by two white men, Allen Ginsberg and Woody Guthrie. But their influences are distinctly not necessarily white America or white cultural influences. Allen Ginsberg was mainly influenced by the Cold War and by Langston Hughes. Those were two of his primary influences. The Cold War is political dealings with Russia, which is a totally different culture than American culture. And Langston Hughes, obviously a black poet from the Harlem Renaissance. Langston Hughes himself was influenced a lot by jazz culture and everything that the Harlem Renaissance implied, but also by the writings of Walt Whitman, a gay man. Walt Whitman was influenced by the Civil War, so the race relations right there, and also by William Wordsworth. Whitman's writing bears a striking resemblance to William Wordsworth. So a British man influencing gay American man, influencing a black American man, influencing a beat poet, influencing Bob Dylan. On the other side, Bob Dylan's music comes from the folk tradition of Woody Guthrie, who was influenced by the Great Depression, and also by the blues stylings of Robert Johnson. Robert Johnson's blues, which I've put on par here with jazz, was inspired by the call and response of the chain gangs in the Reconstruction South. So again, the Civil War influenced creating chain gangs, which created the blues, which became rock and folk, which became Bob Dylan, who has influenced everything since him. I think it's important to visually show this to my students, not just for this topic, but for all topics, all authors, all major texts and movements. Networking. I want to start small and then work bigger. I'm going to start with my team. Parkview is a huge school, absolutely massive. So just in terms of 11th grade English teachers at Parkview, there are, I think, well, as of last year, there were 9 of us. I want to start with them. I want to meet with my team and get them on board with this intentionally adding more multiculturalism into the curriculum. Introduce the Ford Harris matrix, tie in some companion texts to even the most boring dead white men literature, and tie in the cultural influences to all of that. Once I've got my team on board, my 11th grade team, and we have written that into our curriculum, I want to take it to the entire language arts department. Some grade levels, that'll be really easy. 10th grade is world literature, so tying in multiculturalism is very easy in that. Some, like British literature, it's more difficult, but I think it's important for us to be intentional about doing that. And once the entire language arts department is on board with this, I want to create a meeting during a professional learning day sometime this year. It'll probably be second semester, where I meet with representatives or department chairs from each department. I don't want to do this as an entire faculty meeting. People spend faculty meetings on their cell phones and grading papers and hoping it ends. I want to sit down with a small group, a person from each department, and get them on board with writing multiculturalism into our curriculum, into our assessments, into our view of our students. Parkview is an incredibly diverse school. We should be teaching that way, and we should be assessing that way. Thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure all summer.